Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 61st level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf medic, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing this lovely evening, even though I almost forgot to unmute our microphones tonight?
Oh, I'm doing great. I did not realize that until now, but I'm drinking a beer, wearing my RPG Cave shirt. I do this actually every week. I don't know why. It just timing works with my laundry, and I'm like, my shirt's available, so I'm gonna put it right on for the day. And yeah, it's super comfortable, by the way. This RPG Cave shirt, it's really nice.
It's like you're trying to sell it, Garret, even though we're not actually to the point in the show. But it's to be fair,
actually one of my more favorite shirts. Actually, like it fits super well.
It is a very nice shirt. I'm not going to lie about that. Whereas you just don't see it as much from me because, like, it's just one of those things where I have so many shirts that I go through about 20 shirts before I end up washing a lot of them. I'm wearing a Legend of Zelda shirt today, so that's just
that's nice.
What I'm going with today. But enough about our shirts. Although actually, it's kind of fitting that we're talking about RPG hotcakes.
It is,
and I'm wearing a Zelda T-shirt, but. Enough about all that. This is the RPG Cave where we talk about RPGs all the time. So folks at home, if you want to support the show, there's a number of awesome ways to do that. Number one, if you're watching the YouTube live stream right now over on youtube.com/carpoolgaming, or if you're watching the video on demand later, don't forget to like the stream. Don't forget to let us know in the comments below what your RPG hot takes are. Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be notified whenever we go live or whenever we have brand new videos on the channel. And spoiler alert, we're heading into review season, so there's lots of stuff coming to the channel this week, including a Saints Row review from me later this week, maybe a high profile game later this week as well from PlayStation, as well as some other stuff. So stay tuned to the channel. You're not going to want to miss all the stuff coming right here, youtube.com/carpoolgaming. Also, if you're listening on audio feeds, don't forget to subscribe there as well. And don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help us get, discovered and help more people come into the cave with us and enjoy all these great RPGs. Also, if you want early access to this and all of our shows or some exclusive content like a brand new spoiler cast from Dragon Ball Superheroes, head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/carpoolgaming. Throw a little tip in the old tip jar and out comes content. And I think we may actually have an episode of Sweet Hangs coming later this week, so stay tuned for that. And then last but not least, if you want your own RPG Cave t-shirt like the one Garrett's wearing, or any of our other shows t-shirts from here at Carpool Gaming, head on over to our merch store, bit.ly/CPG merch. Well, without further ado, it is time, Garret, to read from the sacred texts, because
let's do it.
We got the hottest show tonight, Garret. Even though it's the middle of the summer, it's hot takes. We're doing RPG hot takes tonight. This was very much a Garret Bland suggested topic. I know that you were very passionate about doing this, and I just went along with it. So if we did something wrong, it's all Garrett's fault. Just throw it out there. As I'm stalling for time, Garret, because I see someone spamming in the chat and I need to ban them. So that's what I did.
Do it.
I know they were here for the hot takes as well, Garret.
They definitely were.
So we pulled together, kind of 10 hot takes between us, although Garret actually came up with a few more hot takes that I was expecting.
I just rambled on. I'm like, this is a hot take. A lot of people are going to be mad at me. Let me write it down on a Word document and see how it goes.
Yeah, so I honestly think that, we're going to have a fun time this evening. By the way, I made Sean Capri a moderator, so there you go. So RPG hot takes. We also got some from the community tonight, so thank you to everyone for submitting your hot takes to us as well. But I think it's going to be a fun discussion because I think we may or may not, we didn't talk about this ahead of time or anything like that, so we may or may not have taken two different approaches to hot takes. So I'm curious to know how we're going to differ tonight, or even if we have any crossovers, because again, we didn't check to see if either of our hot takes cross over tonight. But Garret, since you have the most hot takes, I think we should start with you. What's your first hot take?
Sure. Well, my overall theme when I was thinking of this, I pitched it to Ryan. I want us to try to figure out what's our quirks against the genre, in general. For me, I have a lot of criticism with a lot of games, and they all have common themes for me. Like, I am an RPG fan, just like you. I love to give a lot of these RPGs a chance. there is just some common stuff in there. And I'm like, why did you do this? Why did you do this in your game? It does not add value to it at all. It's not fun. Or a lot of people thought it was fun. And I'm like, okay, never mind. I guess I'm just the crazy person. But yeah, let me see. Okay. So the first hot take, and I think maybe a lot of people agree with me, but I don't think I think other people find it very a device to get into for sure. I think most RPGs completely botch this mechanic. It's a one-story device. This side dialogue that's happening all the time in these JRPGs, in these role-playing games between characters, not necessarily like cutscenes and like side quests that actually has story and you can get in and be interactive like a movie or whatever.
Yeah.
But you're just going up and you're just having dialogue. And I'm like, all right, just read the dialogue. And I'm like, oh no, no voice acting? No. You just go in there and you just, say it how it is, and you have to read the text. You have to read it in the text in their personality too. That's the thing. You have the image of a character popping up. That's a little different than like a book, right? A book, you can kind of personify it a little bit more because it's your imagination. Whereas in a video game, you already have the image and like the setting right there. And you have to fixate that personality into your head as you kind of read it. And it messes with my head a lot. So a lot of games do this. I mean, like the most recent one, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, does it, of course, a lot. And I think Fire Emblem does it quite a bit. And a lot of role-playing games I like. It's just when I get into it, I'm just like, oh no, okay, let's just press A. Let's go. I don't care. And, I go through this and I'm like, okay, I guess I need to know this. And then like full on later, there'll be another cutscene. Oh, you talked about this, right? And I'm like, well, I did, but I just basically, skipped it because it's just, you did it the worst way possible. I don't like this halfway, like, let's have a cutscene and have dialogue. I understand why some of these games need it, but I think it's just way overused in a lot of these RPGs. What do you think about that, Ryan? Is that a hot take for you? This side dialogue?
It sounds like more like a pet peeve rather than a hot take because a hot take would like insinuate that someone out there would like that or is into that. Mm-hmm. Or the popular consensus would be that people are into that type of thing versus the least popular people. No, I hate that. I think that's annoying because I think a lot more people that like are probably on your side with this one, Garrett.
Okay. Sounds good.
That's why I think it's like, I would say it's like a mild take. I wouldn't say it's like
it's a lukewarm take.
It's a lukewarm take.
I am on the side with possibly the majority of people. In the genre.
Because while you were talking about that, Garrett, I thought what you were really trying to get at was also something that I've heard nothing but people complain about in Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which is side talking during battle and saying the same lines over and over again, and having to hear that over and over and over again. Because that's like a common thing in like a lot of
that is a very common
JRPGs nowadays, especially like the Tales series is guilty of that, and a lot of other games are like.
Why do they do this?
I mean, they just want it to sound epic, Garrett. They want every battle to sound epic, even though what it ends up really happening is all the battles sound exactly the same.
And it repeats like 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where I thought you were going at first, but I'm glad that you explained it a little bit more. But you're right. That is a very annoying thing that RPGs.
Okay, so not hot take. It's a very lukewarm take, as Kevin Ainsworth said.
Or Sean Capri says an air-conditioned take. I like that one too.
You know what? I think me and Sean agree. So yeah, air-conditioned take right there.
Cool.
Boom.
Well, Garrett, Sean says to turn up the heat on our takes, so I'm going to gladly
turn up the
do
heat,
that.
Man.
I'm going to talk about a series of games, a trilogy of games that people despise, especially people who are Final Fantasy fans in particular. They hate these games, but you know who likes these games? Ryan Turford likes these games because the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy is not only not bad, but actually good. Now, here are my arguments, Garrett, because a lot of people, at the time that Final Fantasy XIII came out in particular, which is probably the most hated of the three games, although a lot of people dislike Lightning Returns as well. Final Fantasy XIII 2, I think, is probably the one that people like the most. But even then, it's like it got good reviews when it comes out. But if you were to ask a Final Fantasy fan, like, what's the worst Final Fantasy game, they will say one of these three games, unless they say Final Fantasy
Right.
15. But Final Fantasy 13, like the reason why people didn't like it when it came out was people were just used to the old style of Final Fantasy where you generally were greeted with an open environment to explore very early on in the game, and you could go from town to town and from place to place, and it's not very linear. Like those games aren't very linear, whereas a game like Final Fantasy 13, very linear. Like you're walking down for the first like 15 hours of the game, for the most part, for most of the areas in the game, there's a little bit of exploring you can do in the environment. But for the most part, you're pretty much going in a straight line for the first 15 hours of the game.
Right.
And then from there, you then get to a part in the story which makes sense thematically from the story for you to then have this big open world to explore. And then from there, it plays more like the traditional Final Fantasy experience, which is what, people were expecting more with that game. They're expecting, this big open experience. But at the same time, the reason why I think that, these games are actually good is because I think the story in the 13 games is pretty good. It's kind of nonsensical in some areas, in the same way that a lot of other Final Fantasy games kind of do, at least a little bit. But for the most part, I think the story is pretty good. I like the characters in the game. The combat, though, in Final Fantasy 13, of all the modern Final Fantasy games, is actually my favorite combat of the modern Final Fantasy games. Like 10 onwards is what I would qualify under that as well. I also like 12 as well.
13's like a turn-based, but it's like real time at the same time.
It's got the real time gauge that happens just like in other older Final Fantasy games
the
as well,
older Final, yeah,
where the enemies will attack you even if you're just sitting there picking out attacks from the menu, which is why you kind of have to be quick through the menus. You also have to be on your toes with the combat as well, because depending on the enemy formation that you're fighting or the enemy's weaknesses, you then have to switch your party into a different set of formations, which then changes the classes for each of your characters that are in your party. But you can do that all on the fly. It's like super quick with a couple menu presses. And I think those games hold up way better than people just give them credit for, especially when you look at modern video game design, especially when you look at modern RPGs nowadays, because a lot of modern action RPGs, you're kind of doing the same thing as far as, what people criticize about it. You're doing hacking slashing, sure, but you're also you're traveling for the most part in a straight line. And then there's a little bit of exploration you do along the way, but for the most part, you're on a fairly linear path until a certain point in the game, just like Final Fantasy 13 was. So I think for the most part, it almost like kickstarted this idea of making RPGs be a little more linear. And I think RPGs can totally be linear and still be great as well. So I know a lot of people do not like Final Fantasy 13, but I actually really like those games, and especially if you play them on Xbox One X or Series X. In particular with the X enhancements, or if you play on PC, like those games look gorgeous today, especially with the cleaned up cutscenes, and even just the way the game looks. Like Final Fantasy 13 in particular, on Series X looks like a brand new game with like instant load times and everything. So it's a fantastic game to go back to, and it definitely holds up, I think, a lot better than even any of the other modern Final Fantasy games. Besides, something like Final Fantasy VII
especially
Remake.
10.
Yeah. Especially 10.
Oh,
especially 10.
Just don't. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
But yeah, so I know that's a contentious opinion, but I would say that liking Final Fantasy 13 is a hot take, especially again liking it over a lot of modern Final Fantasy games. Like it just people don't really like those games that much. But I think I think there's just bitter feelings from when they came out. But if you go back and play them now, I think you'd be surprised.
Sure. I am very curious about those games just because they play very, very well on Xbox than anywhere else. And it's still on Game Pass, so might as well try it before it leaves Game Pass eventually. It'll probably leave pretty soon, actually.
I was going to say, just don't go back and play the PS3 version, because it's a little bit, it's definitely harder to go back to that one in particular, because you do have really long load times on the PS3. And I mean, the cinematics still look really good because they were 1080p on the Blu-ray for that game. But there's still, I still don't think it's as impressive as even playing on One X, like Xbox One X, I think is a better experience. But there you go. That is my first hot take. And again, I'm kind of doing these in like a specific order, and the takes are going to get hotter as we go on, Garrett. But I tried to be like
Okay.
positivity with my takes. Like I forgot to talk about my stance on this or what I decided to do as far as my hot takes here. Where I wanted to, praise games that a lot of people either don't like or it's just unpopular to like. That's more my deal here, or just throwing my flag down and saying, "Yo, this is what's going on here," and no positivity turned up the heat. That's why we're going back to Garrett, Sean. So Garrett, what's your next hot take?
Okay, my next hot take here. I'm thinking around. Okay, less pet peeve, more against the grain. I think a lot of people will be mad at me. Well, I think people expect this out of me because they just know me by now, especially from my last episode. I explained this. Honestly, I think card battling mechanics in a turn-based game can be, I think it can be a lot easier and a lot more fun than a classic turn-based game.
Ooh.
I think and that's my honestly, I don't have like this big video game or like video card battling RPG to prove it.
Right.
I just want I want an like I want that to happen though because I really think that's true. I think it's heavily underutilized mechanic. I just like the randomization of a card-based like game, but at the same time, you can customize it as like go along with your journey. Like this can be just like it just seems like a lot more flavors can be added into the battle than just like a typical like okay, I'm gonna go through my turn-based game. Oh, going into a battle. All right, I have my same 4 characters with my same 4 skills for the rest of the game. Maybe I'll switch a class and switch a skill, but that's pretty much it. With cards, it's more like, okay, going into it, here's my cards. Okay, what can I use in my hand? How can I strategize with it against the opponent? And I think that could be honestly, I think it could just be a lot more fun. I just want to see I dare someone like any of these developers like I'm just thinking like classic RPG series like Tales, Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, like make a side spin game and make a card battling mechanic out of it. I just want to see how people take to it.
You're not
That's
going to
just
count Pazok, the greatest card game in the multiverse in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, as one of the best card battles. I can't even say that with a straight face because I hate Pazok. So, I
I didn't even
remember
realize that was a thing.
I remember Sean Capri was doing his live stream of Knights of the Old Republic, which won, I think, one of his tournament brackets, and him trying to spend like 2 hours trying to learn how to play Pazok. It's like
Oh no.
one of the worst things ever. But I do think that's definitely a hot take because I know how people feel about cards, Garrett, and a lot of people hate
everyone
cards.
hates them.
Everyone hates
Yeah.
cards. So
They like to shut them down, man. And I'm like, come
Yeah.
on, guys. Like
the
play
second
one.
that a lot of
Like,
people saw that one trailer for Marvel's Midnight Suns that had cards in it, they're like, nope,
yeah.
cancel my pre-order,
They-
it's over.
They instantly shut off. And I'm like, guys, I know it's not your typical hack and slash. Use your brain a little bit. Just like open up some cards and just play the game. Like I feel like it's gonna be so much more fun.
Mhm.
I think. I love my turn-based games. I really do. I love them more of the story than anything. The turn-based stuff, it just gets old. Like it can get old if it's not going along and pacing it right.
Mhm.
And I think a card-based game can mix it up for sure.
Yeah.
And then you can strategize. You can make it really good.
So
So
my only counterpoint to your argument about cards, Garrett, is I dislike the random factor that comes along with cards. The idea that
Yeah.
you could conceivably lose the battle, not because you poorly planned out your tactics, but because you just didn't get the right cards. So there does have to be a little bit of balance that goes into that, and I'm sure not every card game is kind of like that. But just the variance there, I think it's kind of the big problem that I
Yes.
usually have with card mechanics in games, since it's not always well balanced in a lot of games that take advantage of that.
I think you're right. I think it's very hard to balance a card-based game just because of pacing, and also you can't be too overpowered or too underpowered. And how can you make that happen with a randomized mechanic like that? Yeah, it has to be very well crafted for sure.
Yeah.
That's really there's specific card card games, but not a card based RPG or whatever. a card game based RPG.
Well, Garrett, I
There you
am
go.
very excited to tell you about my next hot take. And you might not believe me on this one, but to be honest, like, I did a lot of reflecting after doing our latest video about the Sega Genesis Mini 2 that went up on the channel this week.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of people don't think this way about Sega consoles. In fact, most people usually don't think Sega consoles are good RPG consoles or just RPG consoles at all. But I'm here to tell you, Garrett, the Sega CD is one of the best consoles of all time for RPGs. The quality of RPGs on the Sega Genesis or Sega CD with the amount of RPGs that are on there, especially like when you compare it to the rest of the percentage of the Sega CD library, I think the Sega CD is one of the strongest consoles of all time for RPGs. I think it was also the precursor to the PlayStation 1, to the Sega Saturn, to the PlayStation 2 and other, CD-based RPG powerhouses. But I think the Sega CD really deserves a spot near the top with games like Lunar, Vey, Dark Wizard, Popful Mail. Like, there's a ton of great RPGs on the console, and it's a very underrated console when it comes to RPGs. Like, and a lot of those games as well, just like what I talked about with Final Fantasy 13, just stand the test of time. Are great games to go back to today. I as people probably saw in the Discord, I've been going back and playing Lunar 2 Eternal Blue for an upcoming RPG episode, or RPG Cave episode on Sega CD, and that game's amazing still. Like, that game is still incredible. It's one of the, I would argue, one of the best RPGs of the 16-bit era, up there with stuff like Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy IV or Chrono Trigger or Secret of Mana. Like, I think it's up there in the upper echelons of 16-bit RPGs, as well as the original Lunar or Shining Force CD as well, which I've talked about before, is like probably one of my favorite, strategy role-playing games of all time. I'll go back to Shining Force a little bit later in the show. But Sega CD in particular, I think, is a console that just a lot of people missed out on, and they have this perception from the North American lineup that it was just FMV games. And that's all they think about with the Sega CD. It's like Night Trap or Lethal Enforcers or Ground Zero Texas or Tomcat Alley, like stuff like that, like very goofy, full motion video games. But the Sega CD there was more to the Sega CD than just those. And it's a console that I just wish more people got exposed to. And unfortunately, with the Sega Genesis Mini 2, it's not really exposing more people to the RPGs on that console and showing them more of why it's an RPG powerhouse console. Because we're only really getting Shining Force CD on the North American version, whereas the Japanese version, we are getting a lot of the good RPGs that were on there. I didn't even mention Shin Megami Tensei being a Sega CD game.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of great RPGs on the console, and people don't think of it as a good RPG console, but personally, the Sega CD is one of the best consoles of all time when it comes to RPGs, and I'm planting my flag on the ground. I'm saying it. That's my hot take.
That's well, here's the thing. I'm not familiar with a lot of old role-playing games, especially when it comes to other consoles than just the NES and SNES. Like, honestly, Ryan, I haven't heard of a Sega console until I heard the Sega Dreamcast. And then they just went, like, after that they were done. So I was never familiar with any of this ecosystem, but it sounds like you're preaching the gospel here.
I'm trying.
The RPGs, that we're in the Sega side of consoles, which is pretty interesting to hear. But hey, I mean, I think some people may agree with you that were, Sega kids back then as well. And I know a lot of people, though, are like, what are you talking about? Sega is a hot, steaming pile of garbage. Mario is better. They would say all those lines. But
yeah,
I think that's pretty good.
And I think we can both agree, Mario is better than Sonic, sure. And I think that, like the Genesis in particular, like, was really just known for being, the arcade port machine, whereas the Super Nintendo was, classic Nintendo franchises was what it was known for. But it was really, again, the RPGs are kind of on the undercurrent, and the Genesis had some good ones, but didn't have a ton of them, whereas Sega CD in particular, like a third of that lineup is RPGs, and almost all of them are really good, if not like top tier in that generation. So I think that's why like a lot of people just missed it because the console just didn't sell well or just wasn't as popular here in North America. And I know the chat's already loving this take already, so you can definitely tell that the spice is there, friends. I brought the spice with that one. But
Ooh,
Garrett,
very spicy here.
give me your next one. What's your next hot take?
Well, I think some people may agree with this also, but yeah, I think we're kind of in the best era for JRPGs specifically. This current time right now, I think there's a lot of great role-playing games coming from Japan. I think every company's doing, all of the major Japanese companies are doing very well. Square Enix, Bandai Namco, Capcom, all the series that's been going on for decades, like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, you got Yakuza's in there, you got Persona. They're firing all cylinders and it's become widely popular. And I don't think people expected JRPGs to come out for, I feel like it really started more in like 2016, 2017 or something like that. I think Persona 5 really kicked it off. And then from there, they've had massively successful JRPGs just coming over and over. And this year, I'm just flooded with a lot of JRPGs on my Switch. I can't handle it.
You can't even get to them. There's so many. You can't hold them. You can't hold all the hype.
Yeah, I can't hold all the hype, you know? It's like, you say Sega CD is like the best role-playing game console.
I didn't say the best. I said one of the best.
Okay, sorry.
It's like
one of
it's
the
like
best.
top 3 versus like people saying it's like one of the worst. Like that's the difference.
Okay. I actually just don't have time to go into any classic role-playing games now because I just want to keep up what's already here. And so I don't know if that's a hot take, but that's one side of it. And then I think my other side of this take, the Western role-playing game genre, I don't know about you, Ryan. I don't see much. What was the last good, like, major Western role-playing game that I can't really think of any off the top of my head?
Well, here's a hot take for you right now. I think the last great one was Cyberpunk 2077, to be honest.
Okay. Even Cyberpunk 2077, you got that. That was, well, it was broken coming out, and now it's actually okay. Okay, that's one. And then out of like the rest of them, it's like, okay, where's Bethesda? Where is all these other great studios coming out? Maybe Wasteland 3. Okay, that's a small one, but I feel like the JRPGs, they're really coming out here and kind of taking over the role-playing game genre in general during this time.
Or it's really swung back to like the way it used to be, because PlayStation 2 era, PlayStation 1 era, that was very much the way it was, where it wasn't really until this 360 PS3 generation where we saw the rise of Western role-playing games. Like we saw a lot of them like on the original Xbox, for example, but it wasn't really until the 360 PS3 where they kind of became the dominant RPG genre, whereas nowadays you're definitely right. I do think we're closer to what the PS2 generation was for RPGs, for JRPGs was.
Yeah, for sure. And then like the next big Western role-playing game I'm looking forward to is Starfield. And that keeps getting delayed. And Bethesda, of course, keeps getting delayed on that. And I'm excited for it, but I'm not like as excited I was like with Fallout 4.
Right.
You know, like Fallout 4, I was just mad excited for it. I loved Fallout so much, and I love Bethesda and Skyrim. And now I'm just like, well, a couple of missteps. You got Fallout 4 and 76, and now, well, we'll see how it goes. Like, you got your next role-playing game.
No, I think that between Starfield and Fable, I think are probably the two most promising ones that we know of that are coming. But yeah, you're right. Beyond that, like, who knows? Especially too with BioWare kind of, gone off the deep end. Like, I think
we don't know what they're doing,
because we could always rely on BioWare bringing us like excellent RPGs all the time, Western RPGs. So you're right. I do think you're on to something, Garrett. And a lot of people might not admit that nowadays is like one of the best times for RPGs, if not the best time for RPGs. But it's certainly up there between that or the late Super Nintendo era or the late PlayStation 1 era. I think are like the three greatest eras for RPGs.
For sure. Yeah.
There you go. Well, next one, I know that not a lot of our chat or not a lot of our audience has probably played this next game. So it might be harder to kind of understand why this is such a hot take. But, you know, if you're a fan of a little game called Chrono Trigger, Garrett, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. You know, there's another game that came out in the Chrono series that RPG fans loathe like it's no tomorrow, like the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy. But I actually think said game is better than Chrono Trigger, and that game is Chrono Cross. My next hot take: Chrono Cross is better than Chrono Trigger in just about every way. So between the depth of characters that you have, because you have 49 characters that you can unlock in Chrono Cross versus, you know, your standard party of in Chrono Trigger. The fact that the combat is just so much more refined and well put together in Chrono Cross. Like, it's just much more thought out. I enjoyed the story way more in Chrono Cross. Like, even though you're not going between like different time periods, and you're really only going between two different dimensions, believe it or not, I think I found more variety in the two dimensions than I did going between different time periods, because it felt like the time periods that you go in Chrono Trigger, because it's meant to be a shorter game, are just fairly limited in scope, and it feels like you're going especially in like the future chapter, for example. Whenever you visit the future, I always feel like you're just going to like the same looking building all the time, and it just all kind of like bleeds together for me. But whereas Chrono Cross, every area you go to is visually distinct from the area that you were just in. And then not only that, but when you go to the alternate universe version of that same area, it's completely different from the other version of it. So I think there's just more variety overall in Chrono Cross, and it's just a much more gripping and engaging game than Chrono Trigger. And as much as I love Chrono Trigger, like, it's one of my favorite all-time games, so is Chrono Cross. Like, Chrono Cross is like one of my maybe top 10 games of all time. I love Chrono Cross, and I think it's a better game than Chrono Trigger, and it's heresy according to people in the chat as well. But I think a lot of people, you know, like don't feel that way. But I think also a lot of people just didn't give Chrono Cross a chance, or they haven't played it since it came to PlayStation 1. And I know, you know, the current port, you know, isn't amazing because there's a bunch of, you know, weird graphical stuff with it, but I still think if you give it an honest chance, you might actually agree with me and think it's actually better than Chrono Trigger. But, Garrett, what do you think? I know you haven't played Chrono Cross, but I still have to ask for your opinion on this anyways. How hot was this take?
I mean, I think you're going to get a lot of resistance against this one, for sure. Because Chrono Trigger I think it's just like renowned and like way more noticeable than Chrono Cross. Now, I've heard of Chrono Cross. Don't get me wrong. Like, I heard how great it is, but I don't hear it, you know, oh, it's the seminal JRPG that Chrono Trigger was, you know? I think it's really botched down. Isn't it like more 3D model oriented?
Yeah,
too?
I mean, it's
like,
a PlayStation 1 game, right? So it's like all of the RPGs, for the most part, you know, were 3D model RPGs then. But
so yeah, I think that's partially it, because everyone likes Chrono Trigger because of the pixel art and how it updates. It ages pretty well. I'll hand it to them. But yeah, I think you're gonna get some hot takes, or not hot takes, some resistance there for sure.
I think so too. Well, I did warn everyone that takes would get hotter as the day goes on. Just wait till my last hot take. I'm ready to make people angry. But Garrett, go ahead, give me your next hot take.
Am I at number 3 or number 4? I think
this should be your number 4
now.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. I think. Okay. Well. I'll do this one, and I think a lot of people are gonna hate me for this. I can't really finish older role-playing games, and so here's like kind of my hot take with older role-playing games in general, like why I can't really finish them. It's just I'll just do two specific examples.
Okay.
Final Fantasy VII Classic and Golden Sun. I know those are some of the best JRPGs out there. Everyone keeps talking about how wonderful they are and how the stories are great. I gotta hand it to you. I'm sure it is. Like, I'm sure the story is engaging and everything like that. With Final Fantasy VII, I just have a lot of. It's really the PS1 classic art to me. I cannot, for the life of me, navigate through this game.
Right.
Like, even if I watch a playthrough, it does not like compute to my head this 2D, 3D What is it?
Like running on still, like navigating still backgrounds, but your characters are in like this really blocky 3D.
Yeah, I'm just like, this is some crappy homemade 3D FX graphics, whatever. And I'm like, I understand it's coming from like 1997, and I'm sure it was revolutionary at the time. Like, of course. It's just that when I try to play it now, it's so weird. And I generally don't like the Final Fantasy mechanics, like the
Right.
classic mechanics of the time gauge. I don't know. I feel, and with Chrono Trigger too, I feel so on edge. And I don't like being on edge with my battles. I like to take my time, and like that's why I love Fire Emblem a lot more. But with Final Fantasy VII, I always felt like, okay, I'm doing something wrong because I'm waiting 10 seconds longer. And now the enemy has like 2 hits more than me. I'm like, am I supposed to do something? And I'm like, I'm not real sure. I'm sure there's a strategy to it. I just can't find it. I can't find the strategy in this game. Same thing with Golden Sun. I can't find the strategy. Is there any strategy to the battle games? I can't tell. There's gens, of course, and I'm going back and forth, but I can't really see it. So I just think these older RPGs, they're just so obscure to me, man. It's just like I don't know how to get into them. And those are the two, like, one of like most renowned JRPGs. Everyone keeps yelling me, go play them. And I'm like, guys, I can't really get into it at all. I'd rather play Final Fantasy VII Remake at this point because it plays so good compared to this. So that's my hot take is older RPGs. I think they're just a little obscure and I can't really get into them. At least the two I have examples for. I'm sure there's others that, Chrono Trigger was a special case. I really liked it. But
Yeah. But again, like Chrono Trigger has like a timeless feel to it in a way that just those two particular RPGs, because I know what you're talking about with those, Garrett. Like it's just, they don't, it hurts to say, but they just don't have the same timeless appeal as something like Chrono Trigger does, whether it's, the pixel art or just the combat in general. And because the combat in Chrono Trigger is so, it's so simple, but also deep at the same time. And it just is perfectly balanced in a way that just Final Fantasy VII's combat just isn't. And as much as, and I think people just remember loving Final Fantasy VII in particular because of the story. Like that is the thing that really drew people into Final Fantasy VII. And the characters as well. Like, that ragtag group party of plucky young heroes in Final Fantasy VII is just, people love them so much that it is hard to, or it's just easy to ignore a lot of the warts with the combat system, especially when you have to like grind to earn the extra limit breaks towards the end of the game, or some of the tougher battles, or just how stupidly overpowered some of the late game abilities are, where you just go in and you just one shot enemies just because, which doesn't feel satisfying either, right? So it just breaks that balance a little bit, and Golden Sun's a little bit the same way, where I do think that was kind of the decline for Camelot when it came to RPGs, where they lost a little bit of their luster from the Shining Force games, going from doing strategy role-playing games to traditional turn-based RPGs. I think that's it was a little bit too different for them. But there you go. Well, Garrett,
hot take.
Moving on, my next hot take, again, you might not agree with this one, but I think part of that is you just haven't played enough games in this series. But also, too, this series doesn't really have any modern entries, which is one of the reasons why I'm going to say the following statement. And please don't reach through the screen and strangle me, Garrett. Shining Force is the best strategy RPG series of all time, and I want it to come back. Better than Fire Emblem, better than Final Fantasy Tactics. Shining Force, the series, not excluding the action RPGs that came after. I'm talking about the tactical role-playing games in the tactical role-playing genre from Camelot are the best tactical strategy role-playing games of all time. Whether it's Shining Force CD, Shining Force the original, Shining Force 2, the Game Gear games, those games are incredible for all of the reasons we talked about, liking Chrono Trigger, where the combat itself, it's not too difficult, but not too easy. It just rides the perfect balance of tactics and just fun gameplay. And also it just has really likable characters, and all of them have great stories and writing. And I think that they are very timeless games. Yes, the only downside to them is, some of the button prompts on the Genesis in particular are a little bit wonky with them. So, there's a little bit of a learning curve there that usually doesn't happen with a lot of the games. But once you've got those, once you've gotten past the learning curve and by playing the game for 15 minutes, like, I think they are some of the best strategy role-playing games, if not best role-playing games out there. And I wish that, I know there's like a parallel future in which Camelot was never bought by Nintendo and they stayed with Sega and they continued to make Shining Force games and that was, today's Fire Emblem with Shining Force instead. Like, there's a parallel universe where that exists and that's a thing. And I just wish I could go to that timeline instead of this one, because that sounds so much cooler than what we've got here. But I love the Shining Force games. I think they are incredible, and I think that they are the best strategy RPG series of all time, including better than Fire Emblem. I think they're better than the Fire Emblem games. So I think Fire Emblem has a few really strong entries, but I think a lot of the series is sort of mixed for me. Like, I don't know if all the games are super strong contenders in the same way that Shining Force was. And I think that's just the product of it not being a series that went on forever. Even though we didn't get all the Sega Saturn, Shining Force 3 games here, I think all those are incredible as well, even playing them with English translations, even when they tried to do with those games, because they do go in the 3D direction that kind of Final Fantasy VII does, but it's different because it's a strategy role-playing game and you're not having to navigate 2D environments with 3D characters, and it's not weird in that way. Whereas, it's definitely much closer to like a PS2 strategy role-playing game, as far as, navigating towns and stuff like that. So it's just a much smoother experience overall. But I know you've only played the first game, Garrett, but how much of what I said is heresy, Garrett?
Well, I wish I played more of these series. That's the only thing I want to take. I think what's going to be hard for me is like what my previous hot take was. Like, it's just so hard for me to get into old role-playing games. I think actually the first Shining Force, of what I played of it, I think if timeline wise, if I play, I remember the other classic Fire Emblem game that came out that alongside.
The Shadow Dragon one,
the Shadow Dragon one,
the NES one.
That was just that one was just so. It was very hard to get to even get into. I think Shining Force is way more approachable at that time compared to Shadow Dragon,
or even Shadows of Valentia, which was Fire Emblem Gaiden, which was also an NES game. It had a similar problem too. It's just so obtuse and hard to get into. But even I know a lot of people who, even though they like the modern Fire Emblem games, like even going back and playing stuff like the Sacred Stones or like any of the GBA ones, I know that they have a hard time going back to those too, in the same way that you talked about with the first NES one, which is why I actually think Shining Force is a stronger series overall than Fire Emblem, because almost all of the entries when they were tactical RPG games before they went the action RPG route blow the Fire Emblem games out of the water for the most part. I think that the quality itself is just much stronger or much more consistent versus Fire Emblem, where I think Fire Emblem can be all over the place sometimes as far as quality wise. Sometimes you have an amazing game like Awakening, whereas other times you have Birthright, which is one of the most boring strategy RPGs I've ever played. So, yeah. But there you go.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think you're wrong or anything with that. It's just I haven't played enough of Shining Force games, and absolutely. I hear you. Ring. There's just very few people ringing the bells and alarms for the Shining Force series. We definitely need I definitely need to check it out, because I love my strategy role-playing games, and that's one of the few genres that can transcend a lot. I'm very interested in more dated strategy role-playing games than, let's say, a turn-based classic role-playing game.
That's why I think you in particular, I think going back to it in hindsight, I probably should have told you to play these games instead of Golden Sun, because I actually think Garrett Bland, would probably enjoy the Shining Force games more than the Golden Sun games. I think they're just much more up your alley in particular. But
for sure.
All right, Garrett, hit me with your number 5 before we could go to your honorable mentions.
Okay, so my number 5, and I think a lot of people are not really into these games, but I think Atelier Ryza has, out of all the RPGs, has the best crafting system I've ever seen. in a genre. I don't think anyone is even coming close to it. I think Atelier series itself, it does a very good job at like knowing what materials are out there and grabbing them and putting it into a blueprint and then making a one of a kind item. That's just like you don't ever see that before. I think a lot of other RPGs try to they just they really do. They just half bake their crafting systems. Like Xenoblade, I'm just like, oh, okay, another materials. Okay, I hate the like current like over repetitiveness of crafting in a lot of these role playing games where you just grab some items. Oh, there's a menu. Oh, I can craft this now. Let me just press A and just like okay, it's like kind of automation. Whereas Atelier series does a very good job of like here's like this blueprint, figure it out, how to craft it from one web to the next, from point A to point B. And depending on the path you choose and depending on your materials, you will get your special one of a kind item out of it, whether it's an axe, whether it's a armor, whether it's a staff. I think that mechanic, like not even just like that elaborate or whatever, can be transferred to a lot of other role playing games and make it so much better than just this just stupid automated crafting system that I see in just so many of these role playing games around. Like you think of like the last role playing game that you really enjoyed, and it's like, man, that crafting system was really good. And you're just like, no, you're not saying that at all. You're saying the story's great. You're saying the battle's great. You're saying the characters are great,
Mhm.
but you never hear the crafting system is fantastic. It's just like you rarely hear that. So I think a lot of role playing games need to just build off of this. I think I think that's what got me to Skyrim is a lot of the blacksmithing too. They did a pretty good job of like you can get some items here and there, and then like using your own skills make a one of a kind item, right? You can make an item and then enchant them, and it's great. It's good for you, and you can fit into battle. And I just wish other role playing games did that better.
Mhm.
So I think Ryza, everyone should be looking at Atelier series and be like, look at that, copy that a little bit more than what you're doing right now.
Yeah, we
So.
talked about this on the crafting episode because we did, folks at home who maybe
Mhm.
missed it, we did a whole episode about crafting in RPGs, and I think like we talked about it then, but I think it's just a lot of RPGs add a crafting system as kind of an afterthought or just a way to, give you some more stuff to collect, but then it's never really well thought out. You collect some materials and then you go to talk to some person and they forge something for you, and sometimes it's randomized and sometimes it's not. But for the most part,
Yeah.
that's really how limited it is. Whereas, we were talking about with Atelier Riser, there is a little more to it than that. There's a little bit more meat on the bone to chew on. And I think, there is definitely some dev time that has to go into it, which is why I think a lot of more games don't adopt that type of crafting system. But you're right. Like, I would love to see more RPGs. Like, if you're going to have a crafting system, I would love to see more RPGs, branch out and do more of that type of thing and put a little more time into it. If you're going to invest the time in doing a crafting system, why not make it better? Why not make a Final Fantasy game that has a crafting system as good as Atelier Rises it? Like it just
Mhm.
like it's sitting right there. The blueprint is right there. Just go borrow it. It's like
Just go play it.
it's like what people talk about with
I
Smash
don't.
Brothers all the time, where the blueprint for a great character fighter is sitting right there. Just go borrow it.
Yeah, and I think people look at the Atelier series like, oh, that looks childish. That looks girly. I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to even mess with it. I don't even know what the game is. And like, guys, just look at how good that is. Like the crafting system itself. It's so good. And so I think a lot of other studios can just piggyback and adopt from it for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
nice. Well, Garrett, I am ready. I'm very glad Sean Capri just mentioned he just came back because
Oh
I'm
no.
ready with this final
Yes.
take. As I mentioned, this one's a pretty spicy take, but it's one that if you've heard me talk on podcasts before, especially back in the Game Moose days, you heard me say this opinion before, so it won't come as too much of a surprise for you. But I'm ready for Sean Capri to throw his keyboard, or maybe you as well, Garrett, because I'm about to speak heresy. But so, Garrett, would you agree if I were to ask you the Legend of Zelda series, not an RPG series, correct?
If you put a gun in my head, yes, I would not say it's an RPG.
Okay. But you understand there's a little bit of flexibility there in that you think maybe some games in the Zelda series could be considered RPGs.
Sure. You can argue that some of these are RPGs.
Well,
sure.
I'm ready to argue one of these, Garrett. And this is my hottest take. Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest are not only RPGs, because people say they're not RPGs, but they are RPGs, and they're also the best games in their respective series. So Zelda 2, okay. I've mentioned it before.
No, wait, what did you just say?
I just said Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest are not only RPGs, but the best games in their series. Just let that sink in.
I mean, Castlevania, I don't know Castlevania as much. I played a little bit of Symphony of the Night. Sean's saying to turn off the stream right now, just how spicy this take is.
They asked for hot takes. I'm delivering. I'm just delivering what's in the show title. So let me explain my rebuttal at least a little bit.
Sure, go for it. Yes.
So first off, as far as, because people usually mention that Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2 are not RPGs, because they look at the rest of the series and they're like, oh, well, the Castlevania series isn't, RPGs. There's RPG elements, sure, but they're not full-on RPGs. But Zelda 2 in particular, for example, there's random battles in the game. You've got a leveling system for Link where you learn different abilities as you level, and you become progressively more power as you leveled. There is an equipment system. There's the ability to learn magical spells that then allow you to do different things. And it's more of like a Metroidvania and an action RPG tied together, where you have like an overhead map like a JRPG would, and then when you go into the dungeons, it's a side-scrolling action RPG like the Ys series or something like that. Like, I think that's my argument for Zelda 2 being an RPG. But that's one of the reasons why I personally think it's my favorite Zelda game, because out of all the Zelda games, Garrett, and you might agree with this, it's probably the closest to a JRPG we will ever get from Zelda. And that appeals to me hardcore more than any of the isometric Zelda games ever will. Zelda 2, I love the music in Zelda 2. I love the look of the enemies in Zelda 2. I think they look incredible. Especially I love the bosses and how big their sprites are on the NES. I just love Zelda 2. I think Zelda 2 is a way better game than people give it credit for. People just don't like Zelda 2, I find, or at least I hear people talk about Zelda 2 not liking it because they compare it to the other Zelda games and it feels out of place for them, because it is completely different from the other Zelda games. Whereas I don't think of it as a Zelda game. I think of it kind of as its own thing. But I think that's why I like it the best. I think it's the best game in the series, because I think the formula that they have in Zelda 2 is I like it much more than any other Zelda game that's out there. So we got that, and it's actually kind of the same argument for Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, because, it's very different from the other Castlevania games. It's actually much closer to something like Castlevania Symphony of the Night or any of the Game Boy Advance Castlevania games, where it's same as Zelda 2. You have, you earn hearts for Simon as you play through the game, and those hearts actually give you some extra levels, which give you increased stats, and then there's also an equipment system like an RPG that you have to spend currency on. You have to spend the hearts on it, so you can either choose to level with them, or you choose to pay to buy different items to help progress through the story, or just make Simon's attack more powerful. Like, it just has a lot of great RPG elements in it, and again, just like Zelda 2, it's more of a Metroidvania RPG, where as you're going through the different mansions that you go through in the game, they're kind of like the dungeons in Zelda. You're acquiring an item at the end of it, which then will allow you to progress further in the story, or to get over a certain obstacle that might have been in your way before. And it just, again, it kind of mashes two things I love together, JRPGs and Metroidvanias together, in just a really neat package. Which, again, I think are great in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, as well as the Game Boy Advance ones. But the main reason why I like Zelda 2 better is because in that game, you're exploring the countryside. I just think there's more to see and do, whereas in Symphony of the Night, or the other, Castlevania games that are in this style, you're really just exploring Dracula's castle. And sure, there's different biomes in Dracula's castle, but you're really just isolated inside the castle the whole time, and it just feels like kind of claustrophobic in a way that Simon's Quest doesn't. And I just really like the way that Simon's Quest plays. I like the variety of environments. I love the enemy design. I love the music, where it's a little bit creepy and atmospheric. But then, Bloody Tears is one of the best themes from Castlevania. So there you go. I have to say it. Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2 are not only RPGs, but the best games in their series. Garrett, I want to hear your arguments now.
Okay. I mean, I don't have too much to say just because you have an excellent explanation there. I mean, you love RPGs. You kind of convince yourself that these are RPGs. And you have some great arguments with it. I just think the I like Zelda 2 is like, it's not really computing in my head, because when I was watching Rebecca stream that pile of garbage, and I'm like, what is this game? I mean, granted, I'm a youngling. I'm seeing this game for the first time, and I'm like, what is this Zelda knockoff that I'm seeing right now?
And you know what? When we rented Zelda 2, which was, by the way, the very first Zelda game I ever played, back in the day on the NES, I felt the exact same way that you did. But it wasn't until when I was actually doing Let's Plays on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Ryan Turford, like years ago. We're talking like 2014 is when I started doing that. I made it a mission on my channel to do, full game playthroughs of a lot of older games.
Right.
And I wanted to play through the first 2 Zelda games because, and do full playthroughs of them, because I'd never beaten either one of them. Played either of them in passing, but never had finished them. And after I did that, and revisiting Zelda 2, I was so taken aback by how much I enjoyed it versus, my first impression of it, playing it for the first time, not knowing what to do, not knowing anything about it, that it blew my mind in a way I was not expecting. And then I've gone back many, many times since and played Zelda 2, and now I can kind of beat it in one sitting now, because I just love that game so much. So
you
but
just know it.
But you're right. Like, a lot of people look at that game, especially, again, if you haven't played it before, if you're not playing it, it's kind of weird to look at it first from a glance. Yeah, but I think it's a game that plays much better than it looks on like a long play or a live stream or something like that.
Yeah. Well, Sean in the chat is saying that you're literally single-handedly causing global warming right now on this earth because of that hot take. And I think a lot of people would agree with that, because I know a lot of people are Castlevania and Zelda fans that love the other games, not the ones that you specifically chose. I rarely hear the Castlevania 2 game that you mentioned.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like that game either. But that's because I think a lot of people played that game without a guide, or it was a tougher. It's more obtuse because you have to, discern hints on where to go next from the townspeople. And a lot of people are just like, I don't want to read this one sentence that this town person has to say to tell me where to go. So they just wander around and get lost, and that's not as fun, because then you get lost, and then you usually die, and you get frustrated because you don't know what to do next. But
so, I mean, okay, that's another thing I'm just so confused about with older games. Should I be looking at guides? That's because I go into a game and I love to go in blind and not I want the game to teach me, not someone else to teach me. So what's your take on looking up guides? When is the date? What is the year? Year 2003. Before this, you can look up guides. What is your take on it?
I mean, I think that looking up guides for older games, or any game before the 360 generation in particular, totally valid. And even and to be fair, whatever gives you the most enjoyment, Garrett, without being frustrated, I think is the best approach. And if it is just looking at a guide from the beginning of the game, I think that's totally understandable. And there's a reason why guides are popular and why they exist as a machine for people to actually make a career out of. I think that guides are good for, the video game industry. And I think people should be more accepting of using guides, or be more open to using guides, especially if you're playing older games, because they are a little more obtuse. It's a little bit harder to navigate some of them. And I think guides can help you alleviate that frustration. In fact, one of the collections that's coming out that I'm very excited about very soon is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga collection. Right. And what the developers decided to do, because they knew a lot of people got frustrated with the very first Turtles game, on NES because it is a very confusing game, because it's unclear sometimes as to where you're supposed to go in that game. They actually included a strategy guide in the game that you can go in the menus for and read it for every part of that game. So if you get stuck, rather than having to go to GameFAQs, you just go into the menu. There's a strategy guide right there, and you can consult it on the fly. And I wish more older game collections would do that type of thing. And I know that's a little bit more work to put in, especially because, again, with digital clips, they just took the strategy guide that came out with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that happened back in the day, and they just scanned it into the game. So I think that's something we could see.
That's cool.
More stuff like that. But
cool.
Anyways,
I would be down.
Garrett, what are your what's your honorable mentions? I know you had a couple that we didn't get to.
I think RPGs in general are just way too long these days. They could be cut like half and just have the same amount of value that they do right now. Like, no joke. Guys, just trim the fat. Like, you can really make it shorter. The other one is Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series. Never really hooked me. Never really got into them, even though I love turn-based games. But I am most excited for the recent ones that are about to come out, especially Final Fantasy 16 looking so dope. Mm-hmm. And then Dragon Quest 12 taking a dark turn, it could be more action-based as per hearing in interviews. And I'm super down for that compared to their classic feel and look that they have previously. What else do I have? I think we're in the best era. Yeah, I think turn-based games should be meant to be played only on handheld and not on a big screen. It's just blasphemy. I'd rather play everything on handheld. And that's pretty much it, I think. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I didn't really have any other ones. The other one that I floated the idea of talking about was Persona 3 being my favorite Persona game and the best Persona game. Over Persona 4 and Persona 5, but I don't know if that was a hot take enough to qualify for our hot takes here. Because I know people love Persona 4 and Persona 5, but I just think Persona 3 is just a better game, even though we don't have like a true, like, here's the best version of it. Like, it's kind of like you have to pick one of two ways and make some sacrifices along the way. But I do think, Persona 3 is an incredible game. Whereas I love Sean Capri's hot take, which is most RPG titles are just bad. So there's that as well. So, Garrett,
you're not wrong.
Speaking of Sean Capri and the audience, we should probably get to some of the audience's hot takes, and then we also got a couple general RPG questions as well that we'll get to a little bit later. We're gonna start with Ryan Craig at the Mathman 1024, and he says, a lot of my RPG hot takes are centered on games that you've somehow classified as RPGs. Too many times I'm left shaking my head at what gets tossed into the RPG bucket these days. Slay the Spire as an RPG? Garrett, how do you respond to Ryan Craig's comments here?
Right. It's so funny. I saw this comment and I'm like thinking about it. And I'm like, I guess it's not the classic RPG he's thinking about. I just think, a lot of games now these days, they're taking a lot of role-playing game mechanics. I think Slay the Spire was a special case where I was very limited in my selection of games and genre. So Slay the Spire was one of the best card battling based, and you can argue role-playing game. Mm-hmm. I think there is. You got a leveling system going on. You got strategy going on, HP, MP, stuff like that. Well, not MP. Well, yeah, kind of. Limits the amount of cards you play in the game for sure. A lots of buffs and debuffs going on. A lot. I really think that could be it's just what's lacking of it is really a story.
Right. But we've talked about it before, like what constitutes an RPG. When we did our very first, like one of our first episodes, we talked about how a story is kind of optional. It doesn't. What makes a game an RPG is not just the story, and I don't think it. I think you can have a game that's an RPG that doesn't have a story to it.
Yeah. So, no, it doesn't fit the classical RPG for sure, but it is definitely, I think, still within the bounds of how we define the RPG genre.
Because you feel like you're still playing a role when you're playing Slay the Spire. You're just not playing the role in a story, but you still feel like you're playing that role, and that's what counts. That's the main thing that makes it an RPG. But I'm curious to know what Ryan Craig also thinks, because he also mentions that he apparently too many times left shaking his head as to
Too many
what we throw in
times,
the RPG bucket. So I'm curious to know what other games, because he didn't mention any other games besides Slay the Spire. I'm curious to know what other games he thinks we classified as RPGs that aren't actually RPGs. So Ryan, if you're listening, let us know. I'd love to know.
Yeah. I think of like Borderlands, I kind of mentioned a little bit, and you can argue that's just a first person shooter, but you're playing a role there, so you can say it's a role playing game. And then of course there's a lot of modern games that take the role playing game mechanic, and you may not say that's a role playing game, a la like Assassin's Creed, like Ubisoft games in general, and stuff like that.
So I mean, the modern modern Assassin's Creed games are just as much RPGs as Mass Effect.
They are role playing games.
Like
yes, they are.
They feel like playing BioWare games. So I mean, I don't see a reason why I wouldn't count them as RPGs. But next up, we got Nick at Jennison VT on Twitter, who says Alundra on PlayStation 1 is the second best Zelda game ever made. Even though it's not a Zelda game, it is very much a Zelda-like. But I know, Garrett, you haven't played Alundra because it's a PlayStation 1 game. It's an old game. And to be honest, I haven't played this game either. I've only heard about it, but I've never actually played Alundra before. Maybe I need to maybe I need to fix that at some point. I need to play Alundra at some point. But it definitely, like, if you look at screenshots of it, it is like an isometric, game that looks very similar to Zelda. So it does make sense.
Sounds good.
And of course, Ribo in the chat mentions second best Zelda because Zelda 2 is number one. Absolutely, Ribo. Thank you for hopping on board the correct train. But to be fair, I read Nick's comment for verbatim. I did not add that in there, so I'm actually curious to know what Nick's favorite Zelda game is because he didn't actually mention it here. But next up, we got Kevin Ainsworth, aka the Muffin Mon, who actually had a very similar opinion to you, Garrett. He says, my time has come. My hot take, Dragon Quest XI is incredibly overrated. Sitting at a 91 on Metacritic, I expected a phenomenal JRPG experience. What did I get instead? The most cookie-cutter, basic, and by-the-numbers JRPG I've ever experienced. I genuinely dislike all the party members apart from Jade and the sisters. The game doesn't know when to end. The twist is predictable, and then even when the credits roll, you're still not done. Because yes, there's a whole epilogue after the credits roll in that game, and it's like the Return to the King. It goes on forever. Nothing about this game was exceptional. It felt dated, and as my first entry into Dragon Quest, it made me not to want to play any more of them. And I think that's like,
wow.
People talk about this when they talk about Dragon Quest as a series, and I kind of agree with this as well. Like, it doesn't, like, they didn't go in the direction where Final Fantasy was. Where Final Fantasy, they try something different with each new entry, like each numbered entry in the series. But with Dragon Quest, the formulas always remain the same, going all the way back to the NES ones. Like, that's why, like, Dragon Quest XI has the 8-bit, top-down version of it that's like concurrent with whatever the 3D version of it that you're playing, because it's exactly the same as like the NES games. So, but Garrett, what do you think about Kevin's comments here? Because I know you were like, oh, he's a little bit rough with this one.
Oh, he was a little. Oh, well, I wouldn't say he's a little rough with it. I think, Kevin, he's on the money on what other people think about this game too. A lot of people thought they were getting into Dragon Quest XI. It's like, oh, this is gonna be this massive JRPG. That's gonna be a great experience. And then they just go through it and they just suffer. They're just like, this is taking too long. The pacing is too long. And then, of course, the classic role playing that are into the Dragon Quest series absolutely love this game.
Right.
Of course, it's just like a love letter to them.
Well, if anything, you're getting just more of the thing you like. So if you like that thing, you're going to be very into it. And I mean, you could make the same argument about something like Persona as well, where we've really had the same formula since Persona 3, and they haven't, like, even though 5 added some new elements, like, it's not really too much different than what we got from Persona 3. So maybe at some point, like, maybe we start to feel the same way about Persona if Persona 6 isn't at least a little bit different from 5.
Right. For sure.
Who knows? Next up, we got Nagachaka, who says, I'm ready, haters, but I think Octopath Traveler is overrated. It isn't a bad game, but it is nothing special. Yes, it looks pretty, but the stories aren't engaging at all. I've owned the game for months now, and I'm about 7 hours in, since I just can't get into it. Sorry, but not so sorry. # YOLO. That's a nice touch at
Nice.
the end there. I
Nice.
see you agree with him, Garrett. I think we've ever talked about.
Yeah.
I can't remember the last time we've ever talked about Octopath. So you don't like that game either?
Yeah. I put about like 13 or 14 hours in. I fell asleep. Like every time
Oh my
I
god.
grab that game, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't keep my eyes open. This is so boring. Like, I love the art style for sure. And I love the battling system in certain aspects for sure. It's just the story, man. The stories are just such a slog. They don't make sense. They don't like try to connect them. They're so
Yeah.
disparate. But yeah, I only like that game just because of the art style and the animations too
Yeah.
was really cool in the battle system. But that's pretty
So,
much
so
it.
pretty
I'm
much
in
everything
agreement
but
with
the story you
Nagachaka.
like, because like I think the combat system
Yeah.
is really good in Octopath Traveler. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Yeah.
In the same way that I like Bravely Default's combat system as well. A lot.
Yeah.
And then, but yeah, you're right about the story because I think some of the stories are very interesting. Like I loved Primose's story, for example, and how like she's trying to get revenge. Like I love her whole plot line. But there's also I can't remember her name, but the alchemist. I can't remember her story, but she's just like her whole story about becoming a traitor is just really boring and not very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like kind of a mixed bag. And to your point, the fact that the stories don't collide together or intersect in the same way
Till
that
the
it can,
very,
like,
very end.
yeah. Well, even at the very end, you just like you get it for the optional boss, and even then, it's not.
Yeah.
It's
Pretty
not
much.
like the payoff isn't there in the same way that it is for a game like Live Alive, which has kind of the same formula, but the characters get together sooner in the game, and it just makes it for more of a cohesive experience. I think, which is why I think Live Alive is an infinitely better game than Octopath as well. But I did really like Octopath, I think, more than the two of you did. But next up, Quagmire says, I'll add my overrated game opinion. I didn't think Bravely Default 2 was anything special. Story was pretty much non-existent. I feel like it didn't do anything that any previous RPG hadn't done before it. When I found out the ending wasn't really the ending, I said it's the end for me and I stopped.
Stop.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a lot of the people's opinions for Bravely Default 2, because he specifically said Bravely Default 2
Yeah,
and not
that's
the first
true.
one. Yeah.
Right. I heard 2 is actually pretty rough and the story was like not that good. I only played like the first I think 5 or 6 hours, and then when I heard that I'm like, okay, I'm going to jump off ship now and let me do something else before I get disappointed with this game. I think I play Bravely Default really just for if I want to get that turn-based itch going on. That's a good one to go to for sure. Same thing with Octopath. I think it's like, okay, I'm not interested in a story. Just like give me a good like grind going on. I would definitely go to these games. Quagmire, I don't think you're in the. I think you're in the majority. I think a lot of people, not majority, but a lot of people kind of agree with you that it's not. It's not that great.
Yeah, same with me.
Okay.
Like when Bravely Default 2 was coming out, I was actually really excited for it because I loved both Bravely Second and the original Bravely Default. But it just Bravely Default 2 just didn't do it for me. It just was, it was fine. It existed, but it was nothing. It wasn't really special or anything like that. But there you go. And then last hot take before we get to our audience questions, we got Blaze Knight, who says, not nearly enough games borrow mechanics from the greats in a meaningful way. Chrono Trigger has this awesome double tech system that nobody does anything with in any meaningful way, including the sequel. Chrono Cross doesn't actually use that at all. Lost Odyssey has a cool skill sharing system that is fun and easy to use. Breath of Fire 3 has an awesome dragon game system that no one has replicated. Instead, we get 500 Final Fantasy Tactics clones. I can't even bother to try them. I think this goes back to what you're talking about with Atelier Rising, Garrett, where like there's a winning formula right there. Why don't more people use this? Like, I think you could say that for a lot of these choices here too, which is weird.
Yeah, it makes you realize how narrow a lot of these series are. They just like to be in their own path and they find success. And they're like, okay, let's go to the next game and it'll be just like that. And let's just build on top of it. And Blaze and I agree with you on a lot of this stuff. Chrono Trigger, you're totally right. It has this awesome combo system. I'm just so surprised no other, like even an indie studio
the closest
really
one,
adopted.
Cosmic Star Heroine, took advantage of that. Like it did something
Right. Okay.
because it was very much
Yeah.
trying to be like Chrono Trigger mixed with a Sega CD game, like Lunar with its cinematics. Like that's what they were going for with that game.
For sure. Yeah. That's one great example. Yeah, I just can't think of any other game that really tried to get that double text system going. The Breath of I would love to play Lost Odyssey and Breath of Fire. I heard those are great series. And the Dragon Gene system is interesting. The guild sharing system, I'm seeing a little bit more
Mhm.
actually, and I see it in Xenoblade, and I see it in Nobody Saves the World, and those are like my favorite RPGs this year. So yeah, hopefully I would love to get more customization going in these RPGs. I would love to borrow elements from like these awesome games. Would be great.
Yeah.
500 Final Fantasy Tactics clones. I mean, like I see some like lower tier tactics clones, but other than that, I don't actually see too much of these. I don't know which Final Fantasy Tactics clones you're talking about, Blaze Knight. Why don't you hit me up and just like let me know? Because I think of Fell Seal, Arbiter's Mark. That's one. That's a big one.
Mhm.
And then I guess you can say like all these like Triangle Strategy, and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
other than that, I can't think of any other ones.
Yeah, Tactics Ogre 2 is closer to it as well. Like that's another one I did kind of lump in there as well. But you're right. Like maybe if you just look at strategy RPGs as a whole, you're like, oh, they're all like Final Fantasy Tactics when they're not.
True.
Like, they feel very different. Like on the
Right.
like on the surface, yes, it might look that way, but when you play them, you're like, oh, they're very different games. Like any of the modern Fire Emblem games are like way different than Shining Force, which is way different than Final Fantasy Tactics. Like they're all very different.
Yeah.
Which is all very different from Disgaea, which is kind of its own thing. So there you go.
And Marvelous Rabbits.
There's that too. I'm also going to bring Foolish Fuji's hot take in the chat as well, because I thought this is a good one too.
Sure.
Hot take: Dinkum is overrated. As an Australian living in the outback while surviving attacks from wild crocs and mean roos is not something I want to experience in a game. That's a good take as well.
Nice.
I know Console Kato very obsessed with Dinkum, and I know a lot of people are actually into that game as well. So, but that's a hot take right there, and all the people like that game. But Garrett, we got two other questions. First one comes to us from Rybo at RiboFlavins, who's here in the chat tonight. So hi, Rybo. His question is, can the doctor please explain what a birth bite sleep is? Like, really, explanations by the weatherman are also accepted. Garrett, what is a birth by sleep exactly?
Look here. Rybo, I don't know how to explain this, and I don't even like when I read that. I just don't want to even try to understand it. It's you see those three words together. It's just like it doesn't make sense at all. Like, what are you trying? Is this the Kingdom Hearts reference? Right?
It is.
It's Kingdom Hearts.
It's the name of a title in Kingdom Hearts, Birth by Sleep.
Now that's some obnoxious title right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can't step in and do this. Right.
But you're a doctor. You're supposed to know how medical stuff works.
Yeah, but let me tell you, when they said, "Hey, try to understand the Kingdom Hearts series," I'm like, absolutely not, because that is nonsense black magic.
Okay, then I got to ask you this then. What's probably more difficult than one of the tests you had in university to do when you're getting your doctorate, or trying to explain the Kingdom Hearts series? What do you think is more difficult?
I think trying to explain the Kingdom Hearts series is so much harder than any of my tests, because my tests you can study for and have a material to read it. Whereas these games, you're going to watch it and it's still not going to make sense at all. It's just going to be complete nonsense. Just a bunch of Disney characters together.
Any game series that uses fractions in its titles for numbers,
I can't.
I'm like, no, I'm done. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Hold on. Other hot take I had, honorable mention. I prefer dubbed over subbed in a lot of my JRPGs. You know what?
Me too. I didn't always feel that way, but I feel that way nowadays, because then you're forced to read with subs, whereas you have the option of reading with dubs. So there you go.
Yeah.
All right. Last question of the night comes to us from Yarden, who asks, one lives and one dies. I don't know why he wants to murder one of these, but okay. Who lives or who dies? Square or Sega. I think of the two,
Square or Sega? Oof.
even though I am the Sega fanboy and someone who loves Sega, and I've talked about Sega to death on this particular episode in particular, Square Enix survives because, and to be fair, we talked about this before back on the episode where, what if Sony bought Square Enix? Like, both these companies I think are going to get bought by some bigger corporation at some point. So I think they're both going to survive. So I don't think we'll ever see a situation where either one of these die off. But I think like Square Enix has the best chance to survive because of its pool of IPs and kind of how it's positioned itself in the market, especially because like Sega had like a big portion of like the arcade market in Japan, which just kind of died when 2020 happened. So I think like it's in a little bit rougher shape than Square Enix is. But Garrett, what do you think?
Well, I try to think of the pull of IP as well, and I think what's going for Sega is the Atlas people, and for Square, I think it's Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, in those series, and then of course our smaller series that we kind of enjoy as well, and of course Final Fantasy 14 for you. Um, you know what? I would rather for this is a good question because it's either classic RPGs or kind of zany JRPGs. I'm gonna go with Sega on this one, just because you said Square.
Yeah, I think modern day,
yeah,
when the way we look at the modern market, of the two of them, I think it's Square by a mile, even though I would be very sad to lose Atlas because Sega owns them.
Yeah.
It would just break my heart if that happened. But
yeah, well, Square has a lot of games going on in its IP. It's just that I think at least it's just a lot going on right now with them. Whereas Sega, I think they're catching my attention on a lot, like especially with Yakuza series, and then also Atlas going on. They could do a lot of things over there too.
Yeah, but, and I am hoping that we do see more of their like smaller series that they try and bring back, because I really like the reboot they did of Sakura Wars. I think that was a really good RPG, and also like that even like with the Shining Force mobile game that they got going on right now, which is like Fire Emblem Heroes but Shining Force flavored. Like I would love to see them take that and momentum and try another Shining Force game or something else. Like I think Sega's just sitting on a lot of IP as well that they're just not doing anything with, and I would love to see them try more of that stuff as well. Like even Space Channel 5 or Crazy Taxi or Comic Zone. Like there's a bunch of stuff that can go back. And those are fresh on my mind too, because we got the movie announcements, Garrett. I don't know if you saw this, that Sega's doing of Space Channel 5 and Comic Zone and Crazy Taxi. Those are apparently coming soon.
I heard Crazy Taxi.
Yeah. But
that was good.
Comic Zone movie would be really interesting. Also, before we go, Garrett, do we have 5 minutes to humor 2 last minute suggestions that we got in?
Sure, go for it.
Cool. Yeah, so these came in while we were recording the show, so that's why we missed them. One's a question and one's a hot take. So I'm going to read the hot take first. This comes to us from Nick Fahaba, who says, "My hot take that I'll stand by until I die," which is something I actually talked about on the budget RPG episode. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is not a bad game. Not every game has to be hard or complicated to be worthwhile. It's fun and solidly made, and the soundtrack slaps. Also, Dark Souls 2 is better than Dark Souls 1. Now, that's a hot take right there.
That is a hot take.
Because I know people don't like Dark Souls 2, but Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, I talked about it on the budget RPG episode. Like, that's it was like a Final Fantasy game designed specifically for the North American market to dumb it down a little bit because, we weren't used to JRPGs and to get people into them. But I actually think it's a fun game to go back to, even though people look on it as like a game that's not very interesting. And then he's totally right. The music totally slaps in that game. It's amazing. Go listen to the battle theme from Final Fantasy Mystic Quest if you've never heard it before, because it's amazing. And then last question, I think we touched on this a little bit too, but Purple Rylu asks, I'm curious, what are y'all's thoughts on triangle strategy? Garrett, did you ever get around to playing triangle strategy? I know like for a while it was on your backlog, but did you ever play it?
I played 15 hours, I think, or something like that. I really enjoyed what I played of it. It's just that I play it and I was like, oh, I got the Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Okay, I'm done with that. Let's go back to triangle strategy. Oh, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is here. Let's go play that. So I'm in the middle of that. I'll probably actually, I'm trying to gauge when I'm gonna finish that one. I think main story wise, I could finish it in like a month or so,
Right.
and then get back to Triangle Strategy. At least until Mario plus Rabbids comes in late October. So I think I'll get Triangle Strategy done by the end of the year. And but from what I played of it, I really, a lot of people get kind of taken aback by the dialogue, how much dialogue there is.
Right.
Whereas I really enjoy the dialogue and the voice acting. The voice acting is actually pretty fantastic in this game. The writing's pretty good, at least from what I played of it. I don't know how well it gets in later, but and I like the strategy in it for sure. I'm putting it. I think for Fire Emblem Three Houses, I kind of made it so hard for me that I got really burnt out by the end of that game. Whereas this one, I'm like, okay, just keep it as normal as possible, and just like let me just get through the game and just have fun with it. So that's what I'm doing, and it's actually a really competent strategy role playing game, for sure.
Nice.
What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I think I talked about it on an older show, but I'll mention it again here. I finished Triangle Strategy. I liked it a lot. It's one of my favorite RPGs of the year. I think it's a really good strategy RPG. Is it my favorite strategy RPG game on the Switch? No. Is it my favorite strategy RPG game I've played this year? No. But I still think it's a really solid strategy role-playing game. That again, echoes back to Final Fantasy Tactics. I think Final Fantasy Tactics was, a great game, and I think it's great in the same way, where it's a very elevation-based, strategy role-playing game, and yeah. I did really enjoy my time with it. Yes, it's overly talky, but I was kind of into it. Like, I liked the political intrigue that was there, and yes, they were arguing about, because the whole conflict is about them, trying to obtain salt, but whatever, man.
Yeah,
it was still really
much
good. I still really enjoyed it. So there you go. But anyways, Garrett, before we go, Garrett, plugs go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Blind Explosion. You can also find me on the Nintendo Shack, part of the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network. We're live each and every Thursday nights over at twitch.tv/PSVG. And we're also on YouTube, Apple, and Google Podcasts, and all the podcast services around the globe. So check us out everywhere. And that's pretty much it.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. I actually tweeted a couple times this week, so I'm actually kind of back on Twitter, but not really. But you can go follow me if you want. You can also find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming if you want to go talk to Court LeBond. You can also find us on YouTube, youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, on Patreon at patreon.com/Carpool Gaming, and on podcast services around the globe. So, for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been the 61st level of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.